So let's take a step back and what do we mean by science? So it's not just that it is repeatable, but it's something that attempts to explain the how, or the efficient cause, right? How things came to be the way they are. And by relying on God's word or God's will, that's, I think, what was meant by it's not repeatable. We can't kind of repeat that. But there's one part of Genesis 1 in particular that should strike all of us as being absolutely unscientific. Which doesn't mean it's true or false, right? It's just absolutely unscientific. Now, creation through speech, that's something that we don't have any experience with. But there's something in Genesis 1 that we have experience with that's counter to our experience. So take a look at Genesis 1 again. And it has to do with the sequence of creation. What's the first thing that's created? This is not a trick question. What's the first thing that's created?
The heavens and the earth.
Say it louder.
The heavens and the earth.
No. Light. Right? Light is the first thing that's created. Okay. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. Now, in our everyday experience, where does light come from?
The sun.
The sun. What day was the sun created? Day 4. Okay. So if we have light on day 1, but the source of all light that we know about is only created on day 4, let me just throw it out to you. This is a strong indication that what we call science today is not what's going on in Genesis 1. Anybody want to qualify that, challenge that, say, well, wait a second, you know, you're not taking into consideration something. Yep.
There is a difference between light and a source of light. So like light itself is a concept. It's like, so you create, like, for example, like physical properties or physical rules about like the universe without, you know, enacting them or being able to break that.
Right, but light's not a rule.
But I mean properties of light and stuff.
So how can you create a property without creating that which emits the property, that which causes the property to exist?
Well, just because there's no, like, for math, there's no element in a set, doesn't mean there's not rules governing that set.
But light isn't a rule.
Yeah.
I agree with you.
I'm just saying it could be a metaphor for, I guess it's not, in that case it's a metaphor.
Okay, once you say it's a metaphor, I'm going to say, oh great, that's not science.
Okay.
Science uses metaphors, but when we talk about God said, let there be light, and there was light, if that's a metaphor for something else that's not light, then I'm thinking that's not science. Okay. Now, stay with me. Now, the question is Genesis 1 science? With big air quotes. Is it what folks 2,500 years ago in Babylonia thought was science? Because to the best of our knowledge, fallible, though it certainly may be, Genesis 1 was written about 2,500 years ago, not in the land of Israel, not in the deserts of Egypt and Mount Sinai, but in Babylonia, during the period called the Babylonian exile, when the Judeans, who weren't quite Jews yet, when the Judeans were kicked out of town by the Babylonians in 586, before the Common Era or before Christ, depending on your notation system. Okay? So, does anybody think that was the science of the day? And if you do, I would just point you back, like, what were they thinking? What were they thinking when they created light before the sun? Like, did they think that they were explaining what we call science, or what they understood as the natural unfolding or God's creation of the world? I think for the same reason, it's almost inconceivable to me that the folks who were responsible, or the school that was responsible, or the author for Genesis 1, thought that they were doing science. So if they weren't doing science by our understanding, and if they weren't doing science by their understanding, does anybody have any speculation or any clue on what were they doing? Like, what's a point? I'm not going to give you the point, and I'm not going to give it to you because I'm stingy. I don't think I have the points, or all of the points of Genesis 1, but I think I have a point. And I think it has to do with this distinction here. Let's not talk about Genesis 1 for a second. Let's talk about stories. In a story, what does it mean that light could be created before the sun? What might be behind, what might motivate? This is what you need to think about when you're a literary critic or a historian or an archaeologist or an anthropologist. What might have motivated someone to say something that was so against common sense? Has anybody ever seen light without a light source? If nobody has ever experienced this, you ever experienced it? No, me either. You know, and even when I think about extrasensory kinds of things, I mean, you know, there was something that triggered that blinding light. But what might have possibly motivated a Babylonian Judean, an exiled Judean in Babylonia, to write a story that is so stupid? Right? It's so scientifically illiterate to claim that there is light before the sun. Does everybody feel now that I've pointed it out, does everybody feel how, I mean, stupid, really, do I have to say that word? Okay, let's not say that word. It's Genesis 1 we're talking about after all. How counterintuitive. Okay, that's better. Does everybody feel how counterintuitive it is to have light being created before the sun? Okay, so here's what I think is, anybody want to jump in? Here's what I think is going on. How many people know what astrology is? So raise your hands. Okay, somebody give me 1 sentence, 2 sentences on astrology. Good. Using the position of stars and planets to predict events. What do stars and planets have to do with events? They control events. And that's why you can use their movement to predict the future of events. That's called astrology. Astrology was born in Babylonia about 2,700 years ago. And the fancy way to say astrology is astral determinism, because the stars determine your fate. And when you talk about star-crossed lovers, it means that Romeo and Juliet are destined for no good because of a fate that is controlled by the stars. The head star in the Babylonian pantheon of gods was the sun, because it's the biggest thing in the sky. And so when some parvenu, upstart Judean demotes the sun to day 4 and says, our God's bigger than your God, our God can create light without your God at all. It's not science that's going on in Genesis 1. It's a religious polemic against Babylonian religion. And what's so bad about Babylonian religion? Determinism. Now, that's a value judgment that I just made. I'm speaking as a descendant of the author of Genesis 1. Because the author of Genesis 1 is related, you will all agree with me, to the author of Deuteronomy. And Deuteronomy says, I place before you blessings and curses, life and death. Choose life. But ain't no choosing in a system of astral determinism, because your fate is determined by the stars. Genesis 1 is a religious polemic for choice, for morality, for free will. You can influence. You might not be able to control your fate. There might be a little too much hubris in such a statement. But you can certainly influence your fate. And to say, oh, I can't do anything about it, that's just the way things are because of when my mom pushed me out, that doesn't fly for the author of Genesis 1. There is additional evidence for this idea of there being a religious polemic against Babylonian religion. So somebody read verse 21, please. Come on.
So God created the great sea.
No, God didn't create the great sea. The sea was created a couple of days ago. What did God create? The great sea? The great sea? Monsters. Okay, I didn't know which translation you had in front of you. Hatinanim hagdolim. Besides human beings, this is the only other species that is explicitly referenced in the entire creation story. So, again, as you're reading through a text that is full of generalities, except when you get to the most important point, me, in the creation of human beings, you have to ask yourself, why is the author focusing on this particular species? And this is, if you think about what a great sea monster is, think of the Loch Ness Monster. That's a great sea monster. There's different translations for this, but in Babylonian mythology, the great sea monsters challenged Marduk for divine supremacy. And so this was the Israelite or the Judean author's way of saying, there is only one God. That God has no immediate challengers. And what you Babylonians think of as the great sea monsters that represent the evil in the world and chaos and challenge God's goodness and supremacy, it exists. But it's just another one of God's little playthings that he created on day 5. Questions about what we in the academic community think, could we be wrong? Of course we could be wrong. Think Genesis 1 probably meant in its initial Near Eastern setting in Babylonia in the 6th century BCE. Any questions? Okay. So, Darwin. Let's jump. There are 4 basic ways to imagine religion and science relate to one another. So we're going to call these the 4 postures. The first is conflict. Right? That religion describes the world through prophecy, and it is infallible the way in which prophecy must be infallible. And science describes the world through the scientific method, which is by definition fallible and changing and open to new ideas and paradigm shifts. And one is correct and one is incorrect. If I want to switch sides and still stay within the conflict model, religion is what a bunch of dead Babylonian Jews, followed by dead Palestinians, followed by dead Roman Catholics, followed by dead Protestants, wrote without use of the scientific method. What they wrote is retarding scientific advancement, and only hinders the progress of civilization. Science, now I'm channeling Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett, some other people in this category. Science is the engine to a better world. And so both of the folks on the religious side and on the scientific side have a posture toward the other, whether it's science or religion, that it's not just wrong, but it's actually evil, pernicious, detrimental, retarding. That's the conflict model. Of course, once you come to the understanding that Genesis 1 doesn't have to do with what we call science, it really helps you stay out of the conflict model. Because whatever is going on in Genesis 1 that seems on the surface to be a description of natural history, of the world unfolding, once you contextualize it historically and understand that it's a religious polemic against the Babylonians, well, it does have something to do with science, but the science that it has something to do with is astrology. And I don't know how many people here would go to the mat to defend astrology. I'm looking for hands. Independence. Another posture between religion and science is that of independence. Religion is over here. It deals with the big why questions. Why were we born? What's my purpose? That's not why. What's my purpose on earth? Why did mom get breast cancer? Versus science, which isn't why did mom get breast cancer, but how. How did mom get breast cancer? Because damn, I want to figure out how to stop it. Not just for mom, but for everybody else. And science deals with the how questions. It's got a different method. It's got a different vocabulary. It asks different questions. It approaches things through verifiability or falsifiability through repetition, through the scientific method. Religion is internal, experiential, communal. They're really just two totally different things. And it kind of fits in nicely to at least our understanding of Genesis 1, where if Genesis 1 wasn't even intending, in and of its, forget that it's not science the way we understand it. Even they didn't think it was science. Because, I will tell you now, right? I'm putting on my kippah, my yarmulke. As a person of faith, I would rather not be forced intellectually into the position where I have to say they were wrong. I'll say it. I'll say it, and I'll say it again as long as I think it. My preference is to not to have to say it. Right? I would rather not be saying they got that one wrong. Right? I say it sometimes. But I think, unless I'm fooling myself, and that's always a possibility with all of us, that I think what's going on in Genesis, even they didn't think was science. Because it just wasn't on the radar screen for them. Right? What we call science wasn't on their radar screen. That really didn't happen for hundreds of years later until the Greeks and Hellenistic civilization met, confronted, clashed, right, pick your verb, with the biblical tradition, which doesn't happen for at least another 200 years from what we're talking about. Integration. Well, religion and science are describing the same reality. And so there's nothing that is in the Bible. And since we're talking about creation, we're usually talking about the Hebrew Bible. There's nothing that's in the Bible that isn't scientifically accurate. And thank God Einstein and Darwin came along to teach us how to read the Bible. Because once you apply Darwin's theory of natural selection and Einstein's theory of relativity, then you understand that the 6 days using time dilation are really 13.4 billion years. And if you guys weren't such mathematical illiterates, I would show you the math. Actually, I was the guy that says this is a guy named Gerald Schroeder. And how old was I? I was 24. And I spent I spent 3 days in a seminar in Jerusalem. And he lectured 2 of those days. So I was 24 years old. And he went through the math. He's got a PhD from MIT. He went through the math. I didn't follow it. I'm not sure if anybody in the room followed it. But, he shows how in a forward-rushing universe, if the clock is at the edge and if you're in the middle, that 6 days equals 13.4 billion years, which is the scientific age of the universe. Although it was revised down not so long ago, so I was very tempted to email him and ask him if he was going to have a second edition of his book in order to account for the discrepancy. But that would have been nasty. And it's always a good thing to restrain your nastiness. And this idea of natural selection, there have been several books written in both the Christian community and the Jewish community. And the Catholics and the Protestants tend to focus on different things in Genesis 1, but showing how natural selection and evolution are built into Genesis 1. And it's really not so much of a stretch to do that because Genesis 1 happens in time. Right? It happens over a period of days. Oh, and just because, the sun isn't created until day 4, so, we've got, it's the energy of the Big Bang. Right? What's created on day 1 isn't light like in our spectrum of visible light. It's just radiation. And you don't get the kind of visible light until day 4 when the sun is created that emits light waves that human beings will eventually be able to perceive. And I say eventually because the sun was created on day 4, human beings are not created until late afternoon on day 6. By the way, as long as I mentioned late afternoon on day 6, I find it absolutely amazing that we don't get our own day. Day 6 is initially populated by land animals that are not created in the divine image. And only after all the other land animals are created are human beings created in God's image. I think that's an incredibly, what do I think that is? I think that's dialogue. I do not believe that the author of Genesis 1 knew or was pointing us toward the scientific theories of the 19th and 20th centuries discovered by Charles Darwin and Albert Einstein. But I do think, because I am an adherent to the dialogue school as opposed to the integration school, that there's a couple of things in Genesis 1 that are just so mysteriously prescient, perceptive, wise. And one of them is this idea that human beings, while we might be the pinnacle of creation, we have so much in common with other land animals that the author of Genesis 1 had us created on the same day. And so that kind of dialogue back and forth between religion and science, and I think it can go in both directions as well, that's something that characterizes the dialogue school. All right, any questions about these 4 imposters? Okay. Let me give you one other example of the dialogue model. The Council of Nicene. You guys have it yet? Okay, 325. Verse 26. Na'aseh Adam b'tzalmenu u'k'dimutenu b'tzelem Elohim nivrei Adam. God said, let us create Adam. Come to my lecture later and I'll translate that for you. In our image according to our likeness. This is a little strange because up until this point in the narrative, God has been speaking in the first person singular. And this is the first time the first person plural is introduced. So, God, according to the Council of Nicene, is speaking to whom? What's the canonized Christian interpretation? To whom is God speaking? Right? Part of the Trinity, right? God speaking. Jesus, Father, Son. Okay. So, I'm not sure if there were competing interpretations within Christianity at the time, but within Rabbinic Judaism, or the Judaism that we come to know as Rabbinic, there were a couple of other options. All of them, not all of them, one of them is just as far-fetched as the Council of Nicene's explanation. And so let me start with that one. God was speaking to everything else that had been created up until that point. Right? If God says we, to whom is God speaking? The only other players, the only other cast members on stage at that point are what God has created. And I love that. It's far-fetched. I said that. It's far-fetched, but I love that idea that the rabbis, the early rabbis, got that what we are is some mysterious product of the animal kingdom and God. And that explains the we. What do Bible scholars think? Bible scholars think that God was speaking to his angelic host. Where are the angels? If you look in 1 Kings, you actually have an example of God speaking or God consulting with the angelic host. It's not in Genesis 1, probably because there was an agenda of depopulating heaven in the midst of this Babylonian religion, so they stripped God's speaking partners out. But in other parts of the Bible, you see where God is speaking to the angelic host and consulting with them. Okay. Jewish responses to Darwin. So, Darwin published in November of 1859. Sold out in a few days. It was hot news within the natural historian, natural scientific community. What's happening in 1860 in this country? Civil War, right. We're busy, right? Get back to us on this. We had this decade-long period of Civil War and Reconstruction that really prevented everybody except the most plugged in the scientific community of dealing with Darwin. The Europeans got a big jump start because they had their revolutions in 1848. And so by the time 1860 rolls around, in England and in Germany, this idea of natural selection, descent by natural selection and evolution, really has a chance to take hold. So by the time most Americans have a chance to respond to it, it's colored through the bloodiest war that America has ever experienced, the Civil War. And there was a sense very early on, and this sense was fostered, not by Darwin, but by a Brit by the name of Herbert Spencer. And it's this notion of survival of the fittest. Darwin didn't use that term in the first edition of The Origin of Species. There were 5 editions, and eventually he did include that idea. But survival of the fittest is kind of like might makes right. And after you've just been through a really bloody civil war, you can see, you can imagine where politically the idea of might making right, of survival by being the strongest, is something that it's an idea that you wouldn't necessarily want to promote as being true about the natural world, and then come out and say, and we're just an extension of that natural world. Because what about Lincoln? And what about ideology? And what about racism? And what about freedom? And what about the right to have life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? So what you really see in the reactions to Darwinism, everywhere you go, is how politically and religiously charged this biological theory was. Darwin doesn't call his book On the Origin of Life. It's it's on the origin of species and how different species emerge over what is now becoming accepted as a really, 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 really long time. So the idea of deep time, of the world being like way older than 10,000 years, has taken a hold by 1870 in the scientific community. 44% of Americans, consistently over the last 30 years, don't believe in deep time. The world was created pretty much the way the world is over the, in the last 10,000 years. 42%, 44% since Pew started doing polls on this in 1984. But you start getting in the 1870s challenges to accepted understandings of the way the world, the way we have thought that the way the world has always been. And you start getting the challenges around geology, and you start getting the challenges around speciation and biology, and at the very same time, in 1860, there's a little tiny book in English called Essays and Reviews, and it's the first book of biblical criticism in English. This was an idea that was developed in Germany, but at the same time as you have Darwin, you might almost call it providential. At the same time as Darwin's theory comes out, the notion that God's self, did not dictate the Bible to Moses at Mount Sinai, but that there were a bunch of guys over hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years that wrote different pieces of the Bible that later got stitched together. And we'll talk a lot more about that in my second lecture. So all these challenges to a traditional worldview slam into Europe and America at this pretty vulnerable period in American history. And so there's a couple of different ways of responding to this. The first way is to say, you know what? Genesis 1 was science, and they're wrong. It's got nothing to do with how we understand history today. Science today. And the reason why it's wrong is because it's not divine. Read biblical criticism. Once you accept that human beings and not God wrote or authored the Bible, then it's easy to pull away from the conflict and say, look, Genesis 1 is a bunch of primitive myths about creation. Just like the Greeks had their myths and the Babylonians had their myths and the Akkadians and the Ugarites and the Egyptians, this was the Israelite myth of creation. Don't worry about it. What did they know from science? That was one response. And that takes care, that takes care of the textual problem. So now we've got some problems. Textual. What do you do with Genesis 1? So if you think it's science, then you have to say it's wrong science if you want to be in the scientific mainstream at this point. And so that was a response. Another response was, well, we know that it's not science, and we know that it's not to be read literally, because of things like the sun being created after the light was created. So that tells you that it's true because it's divine, for those people that still want to hold on to that notion of divine authorship, but that there are mysteries in Genesis 1 that cannot be deciphered through a plain, literal surface reading of Genesis 1. We've always known that, and for the Jews, who have a 2,000-year-old tradition of interpreting the text in ways that are sometimes wildly different than what the text seems to mean, or differently than what the text seems to have meant, that notion that you've got to read beyond the surface reading, that's a very common approach to reading the Torah. So you can say it's not science. No, sorry. You can say it's bad science. Old science. Old science. Or you can say it's a mystery. Right? And you need a deep reading of it. You need to interpret it. And so some of the Orthodox folks in the Jewish community that want to hold on to the divinity of the text, not because they give a darn about science, but because if you question the authorship of Genesis 1, you'll question the authority of biblical law and Jewish law. And for the Orthodox, that's what defined being a Jew, was allegiance, commitment to Jewish law. So both of these work, right? You can either say, no, it's bad science, or it's fine science, but we just don't understand what it means. And then eventually, wow, look, Darwin came along and showed us what it meant. Of course, then what do you do with Genesis 2, which happens in one day? But that's another textual problem. So the text of the Torah is one big problem. Another big problem, and in my mind, a much bigger problem. More and more scientists are doing these things called excavations. And they're finding fossils. Cool. The problem with finding fossils is when they don't match up to anything that we currently have in existence. So we say they're extinct. Okay. Well, then it kind of makes you ask the question, why would God create a species only to have it go extinct? So there's this notion in Judaism and Christianity of providence. And what we have now estimated, and it still gives me a pit in my stomach to say it, because the number is so bald. 99% of all species to have ever existed or evolved are now extinct. What is current on our Earth today represents only 1% of animal species that were ever in existence through the 4.5 billion years of Earth's history. So that raises real questions about providence, like what's the plan here? And related to providence is teleology. Teleology means the end of things, like what's the point? Teleology. And theodicy. So how, right, like, no matter how this ramification, this radiation of species happened, that resulted in us, which I'm really thankful for, right? Usually I'm pretty thankful. But not only how do I explain 99% of all species that were ever created now being extinct, that has nothing to do with the Bible in Genesis 1. This is not a textual problem. This is a religious problem. And how then do we explain this idea of theodicy, where so many bad things continue to happen, but not just to me, and not just to the Jews, and not just to humans, but to species? Like, now let me say it in a really provocative way. What kind of evil genius created a world which is run through natural selection? where there's massive decimation of species, where there's much, depending on where you train your light, where there's much more struggle and death and predation than there is joy and happiness and love. Like, what kind of God, and this goes back to a question David Hume asked, and René Descartes before him, what kind of God could possibly be responsible for the world that the natural historians, or today what we call scientists, describe? And there's no better place to end than that. Questions? I won't end with that, it's just dramatic. So, what I want to point out here is that this is child's play. Genesis 1, get over it. It's like, it's a straw man. It's a total straw man. This is not the problem. You don't know about what the real problem with evolution is, and it's not Darwin. It's not Darwin's theory. It's natural history. It's the world being, it's the universe and the world being this old, and the fossils that we find of all these extinct animals. According to Platonic, later Christian doctrine, there was the theory of plenitude. Well, the theory of plenitude meant that whatever was created will always be in existence. There won't nothing will go extinct. And we have every little gradation of creation filled. Like every niche is filled. But at least this idea that there isn't any extinction was another one of these Christian, and in a lot of ways, evolution is much more difficult for Christians than Jews. Let me say a word about that. But the original sin. Original sin is a textual idea from Genesis 2 and 3. And it has to do with the transmission, the biological transmission from Adam and Eve, from their transgression. But once you start talking about evolution of a species as opposed to the creation of an individual or two individuals, you can say, well, you know, way back when Homo sapiens evolved, there were these initial two that survived and they were commanded by God, but it starts to become more and more difficult. So one of the bedrock foundations of Christianity, which is original sin, which explains why Jesus died on the cross for our sins, is challenged by evolution, not Darwin's mechanism in particular, but evolution, in a way that Jews don't have that problem. So with Jews, you have to either reject Genesis 1 as science, or say it's mysterious, or the process that I've just gone through with you of showing that it never was science to begin with, which is a relatively new model. But then you're still stuck here in terms of providence and theodicy. And so the cutting edge of theology these days, and it's been like this for the last 20 years, is how do we understand God in an evolutionary world? And I will tell you that there is no really gratifying resolution to that question, but it's not structurally or philosophically different than what do we do with mom getting cancer? The idea of evil for a human being, evil happening to a human being, the mystery of evil in a world that doesn't seem to be deserving of that evil is just writ large in evolutionary history. When instead of mom getting breast cancer, it's why did this meteor hit the planet Earth, throwing 99% of species into extinction and setting off an ice age for 10,000 years? Right? It's philosophically, structurally, it's the same question, just on a cosmic scale. Right? And then when you start talking about black holes, you're talking about a galactic scale. Okay, questions? So most Jews want evolution taught. They believe that evolution is an accurate explanation for the unfolding of species on the earth. They reject the 10,000-year-old calendar. They have no problem with understanding the text one way or another. But this idea of teleology and theodicy, although there are religious responses, the religious responses look more and more like, what do you do with the Holocaust? And so the kind of free will argument that God doesn't intervene in human history once things get going, you see then in parallel with natural history. God sets up a universe that can eventually precipitate the emergence of someone like us, something like us created in the divine image, but can also run into lots and lots and lots of evolutionary dead ends. Is it comforting? I guess that's a personal question. Is it true to what we know about the universe from science and from the best wisdom that doesn't contradict science? I think so. Are there other explanations? Undoubtedly. But whatever your explanation is for the scientific acceptance of evolution, whether it's by Darwin's mechanism or anybody else's, right? If you're from a textual tradition, you need to deal with the text. But forget the Bible. Right? You still have to deal with this idea of a providential, caring God who wants to do good for God's creatures. And that is the real challenge of evolution to religion. Okay. I'm not going to say any more unless there are questions.
So how do you deal with providence? How do you deal with that question yourself personally?
Yeah. The question is, how do I deal with that myself? Already in the Bible, and much more so in the rabbinic material, there is a frank admission that God is not omnipotent. In the stream of the Talmud that becomes Jewish mysticism, there is an emphasis on the radical claim that God's future is in human hands. The way in which that unfolds in the rabbinic period, meaning the time the New Testament was written in the first couple of hundred years of the Common Era, and in the Middle Ages, God could be helped through the ritual commandments and through the other commandments in the Jewish tradition. I don't believe that. But I do believe that there is a direction in the world, in the universe, and that when we get on the divine side of that direction, we are furthering and enhancing and augmenting divinity within this universe that isn't anti-divine. I'm not a Gnostic in the sense of thinking that there are evil forces that are autonomous or independent, but I do think that the world has an awful lot of empty space. And that empty space can be filled up with nastiness, but that nastiness can also be redeemed. And so I try to figure out, using the wisdom of my tradition, and now thank God I live in a time where I also have access to Christianity and Taoism and Hinduism and the other wisdom traditions of this planet. And I use those traditions to try to figure out how I can best augment what I understand to be the divine direction of natural history. So it's a real challenge. My dad wanted me to become a lawyer. I decided not to.
Very good.
Other questions? Okay, thank you very much. You're
you're all around at 4 o'clock today, there'll be another lecture here by Shai in this exact room, 4 p.m., and the title of the talk will be called Lilith and the Primordial Hermaphrodite, a Jewish interpretation of Genesis. Thank you very much for coming.